Welcome to this theological explainer video on branch theory. Have you ever wondered how multiple different Christian denominations can all simultaneously claim to be part of the one true church despite their differences? Well, today we're diving into an absolutely fascinating theological map, and I'm going to attempt to explain how historic Christian institutions map their foundational identities amidst profound division. We're going to look closely at the boundary problem of a divided church, and we're going to try and trace how different traditions answer one of the hardest, most consequential questions in all of Christian history. Let's get into it. So how exactly does a divided church remain one? This is the core mystery we're unraveling today. I mean, think about it. Through 2,000 years of broken boundaries, you have deeply sincere Christians claiming entirely incompatible things. You have these monumental schisms, moments where popes and patriarchs were literally slapping excommunication papers on each other's altars. When that happens, how is the one true church actually identified? Christ didn't exactly leave behind a modern organizational chart. So the real challenge is finding where the true boundaries lie without just trying to rewrite history or ignoring the massive rifts that actually exist today. So here's your path for today. 1. The shared foundation. 2. The complication. 3. Looking at the Reformed view. 4. Classical branch theory. 5. The broader branch theory. 6. Evaluating these things together. Section 1. The shared foundation. The word Catholic. Originally, this meant universal, or according to the whole. It actually predates its modern denominational use by centuries. Then we have this absolutely vital distinction between the visible and invisible church. It's crucial to understand we're not talking about two separate churches here. Think of it a bit like citizenship in a nation. The invisible aspect is like your true internal loyalty. It protects against the dangerous idea that salvation is purely about having your name written on an institutional enrollment sheet. Conversely, the visible aspect is the public record, your passport. It ensures the church isn't reduced to just a private internal feeling. It has a real, public, tangible presence in the world. And that public presence takes form through what our source material calls the biblical architecture of the church. See, Christ founded one visible universal church characterized by incredibly concrete practices. Instead of just a list of rituals, think of these as the defining traits of a recognizably public family. We're talking about a public confession of the apostolic faith, the steady proclamation of the word, baptism, the Lord's Supper, public ministers called to teach and to govern, and church discipline. These weren't meant to be the secret handshakes of some underground society, right? They were designed to make the church publicly identifiable, functioning much like a visible kingdom on earth with very clear borders and practices. Section 2. The complication. Which leads us right into the inevitable historical crash. What happens when the church splits? And I'm not talking about a minor friendly disagreement. I mean massive, mutually condemning institutional ruptures. Think of the East-West divide back in 1054, or the massive shockwaves of the Reformation. Just imagine the sheer chaos this caused for everyday believers trying to figure out where the true church went. When both sides claim to be the true inheritors of that beautiful biblical architecture we just talked about, and both sides officially excommunicate each other, well, where does the visible Catholic Church actually reside? Section 3, the first map, Reformed theology. Okay, so the Reformed tradition, which I'm part of, which is highlighted in documents like the Westminster Confession, introduces a fascinating concept called graduated purity. They view the institutional purity as a spectrum, not just a binary or one-off switch. Just as a deeply sick person is still fundamentally a human being, a flawed or impure church is still a church under this view. This means that a particular congregation or even a whole denomination can be seriously impure, hold to error, or have significant institutional defects, yet still remain a legitimate part of the visible Catholic Church. The key takeaway? Serious defects do not immediately erase church status. So the crucial point is that the Reformed tradition doesn't look for an unbroken line of laying on of hands passed down directly from the apostles. Instead, theologians like Calvin rely on functional marks. Basically, if you have the pure preaching of the word, the right administration of the sacraments, church discipline, then you have a church. They absolutely acknowledge that councils have real ministerial authority to govern the church, but importantly, they believe post-apostolic councils can and do indeed err. Ultimately, this map is based on the faithful function of the church rather than some uninterrupted institutional pedigree. Section 4. Classical branch theory. Fast forward to the 19th century, and high church Anglicans found themselves in a massive high-stakes theological dilemma. We're talking about the historical context of the Oxford movement. These Anglicans needed a theological framework to prove they were a continuing legitimate portion of the ancient Catholic Church, reformed in doctrine but totally separated from Roman jurisdiction. They basically needed to solve a puzzle. How do we legitimize our standing as deeply ancient and apostolic while fending off the claims of both the Roman Catholic Church on one side and Protestant dissenters on the other? To solve this, William Palmer and others developed 3 strict non-negotiable criteria for a separated communion to be considered a legitimate corporate branch of the one true church. Step 1 is the apostolic faith. This means strict continuity with the ancient creedal and sacramental faith. Step 2 is apostolic succession, specifically a historic episcopal ministry, meaning they needed a literal tactile line of bishops descended directly from the apostles. And step 3 is valid sacraments, a Eucharist and baptism, celebrated by that validly ordained ministry. Now, applying these 3 strict rules creates a profoundly closed system. The classical 3-branch map recognizes only the Roman Communion, the Eastern Communion, and the Anglican Communion as estranged but legitimate branches of the one Catholic Church. Because it so rigidly requires that unbroken line of bishops, it inherently and purposely excludes all non-episcopal Protestant bodies, Presbyterians, Lutherans, even Baptists. Under this specific 19th century map, they are completely outside the branch structure. Section 5. Broader branch theory. So where the classical theory is a locked, closed loop requiring traditional bishops, modern theologians like Sean Luke out of Anglican Aesthetics propose a broader branch theory. Now this is an open map. It completely shifts the paradigm by accepting the presbyterial succession, which is the laying on of hands by elders or presbyters rather than traditional bishops, can still create a valid apostolic ministry. By making this theological adjustment, it does pull out a chair at the table for Lutherans, for Presbyterians, and other historic traditions that lack a formal bishop structure but absolutely maintain sacramental continuity. Now, what's really interesting about this is the crucial distinction between 2 Latin terms, esse and bene esse. The modern broader argument is that the traditional threefold episcopal ministry of bishops, priests, and deacons isn't part of the church's esse, meaning its very essence or absolute requirement to exist. Rather, it belongs to its bene esse, which is its well-being or its ideal health. This is a massive theological pivot. It means non-episcopal ministries might be missing the absolute ideal structure or order of the ancient church, but their ministries and their sacraments are entirely valid and real. Section 6. Evaluating the map's strengths and weaknesses. So let's weigh this out. On the strength side, branch theory beautifully explains how a divided family can fundamentally be a family. It acknowledges genuine grace and valid sacraments operating outside of one's own borders, avoiding a strict one communion monopoly. But the weaknesses, I must admit, are severe. First, the boundary problem. Who exactly has the non-circular authority to define what counts as a branch? Then the epistemic problem. When the branches fiercely disagree on doctrine, how do we know who is actually right? And finally, the visible unity problem. This is perhaps the most tragic reality of the whole shebang. If these branches share the same map, but they literally cannot share a communion table together without violating their own rules, is the church actually visibly one in any meaningful sense? Branch theory is strongest as an explanation of how genuine church reality can survive a tragic schism, and weakest as an explanation of how ordinary Christians decide which disputed teaching is true. It perfectly maps the existence of a divided Catholicity, but it pretty much completely fails to provide a mechanism for doctrinal adjudication. So what does all of this mean? If the branches fundamentally disagree in core doctrines, how can an ordinary Christian decide which disputed teaching is true? It is the ultimate epistemic puzzle of divided authority, and one that a theological map must eventually confront. Thank you so much for joining me in exploring this fascinating topic. I hope this has helped in a sense. This is still something that I'm working out, and I appreciate and look forward to hearing your comments.